Every man in that room had one unspoken rule. Never challenge Kang Jinhyuk. Not in public. Not in private. Not even by accident. Because Kang Jinhyuk wasn't just a CEO. He was the kind of man whose decisions moved millions before lunch, and destroyed lives before dinner. The kind of man whose silence was more terrifying than most people's anger. He never listened. Not to excuses. Not to opinions. And definitely not to people beneath him. He never tolerated mistakes. One wrong number could cost you your job. Two could cost you something far worse. And in a company where billions flowed through glass walls and whispered deals, everyone knew their place. Speak when spoken to. Agree when required. Survive at all costs. So when the quarterly strategy meeting began that morning on the 48th floor, the tension in the room wasn't unusual. Executives sat stiffly, eyes locked on their screens. No one dared to breathe too loudly. At the head of the table, Kang Jinhyuk flipped through a financial report with slow, deliberate precision. Expression unreadable. Presence suffocating. A senior director stood beside the screen, presenting projections tied to a $10 million investment deal. His voice was steady, but his hands weren't. Based on Q3 adjustments, the director continued, we expect a return margin increase of. Continue, Jinhyuk said flatly, not even looking up. No praise. No reaction. Just pressure. The room leaned into silence. Everyone nodded along. Because that's what you did when Kang Jinhyuk was in the room. You agreed, even when something felt off. Especially then. At the far end of the table, barely noticeable, sat an intern. New. Quiet. Invisible. Amara Johnson. She wasn't supposed to speak. She wasn't expected to think. And she definitely wasn't supposed to interrupt a meeting like this. But as the numbers continued to roll across the screen, her eyes narrowed. Something didn't add up. She checked it again. Then again. Her fingers tightened slightly around her pen. Her heartbeat quickened. No one else noticed. No one else questioned it. Because no one else dared to. The director finished his explanation. Silence followed. The kind of silence that meant approval. The kind that ended meetings. The kind that sealed decisions. Jinhyuk closed the file. Proceed, he said. And that should have been the end of it. It always was. Except. One voice broke the silence. That number is wrong. The room froze. Every head turned. Every breath stopped. Because no one spoke like that in front of Kang Jinhyuk. And yet, the intern didn't look away. She didn't flinch. She didn't even realize what she had just done. Jinhyuk slowly lifted his gaze and locked eyes with her. For the first time in years, someone had interrupted him. And worse, corrected him. The air shifted. Heavy. Dangerous. Unforgiving. Because in a world where power was everything, correcting Kang Jinhyuk wasn't bravery. It was a mistake. A very expensive one. And what she didn't know yet was that correcting him might have just put her life in danger. Kang Jinhyuk did not build his empire. He inherited it. And then he made it untouchable. In Seoul's financial district, conglomerate towers stood like monuments to power, but none of them cast a shadow as long as his. Kang Global Holdings wasn't just a company. It was a system. A network. A machine that moved money, influence, and silence through channels no outsider could fully trace. On paper, it was clean. Real estate. Tech investments. International logistics. But beneath the surface, there were other operations. Ones that didn't appear in quarterly reports. Ones that didn't need board approval. And at the center of it all was Kang Jinhyuk. He didn't shout. He didn't threaten. He didn't need to. Because everyone who worked for him understood one thing. If Kang Jinhyuk noticed you, it was already too late. He never raised his voice. He never repeated himself. And he never forgave mistakes. In the executive floors of Kang Global, silence wasn't just a habit. It was survival. Meetings were precise, efficient, controlled. People spoke only when necessary. Even then, they chose their words carefully, like stepping through a minefield where one wrong move could end everything. Assistants rehearsed emails before sending them. Directors triple-checked every report. And interns learned quickly to disappear. Because in a place like this, invisibility was protection. The boardroom on the 48th floor was where it all came together. A long obsidian table stretched across the room, reflecting the city skyline behind floor-to-ceiling glass. Leather chairs lined both sides, filled with men and women who had spent their entire careers climbing to this level, only to realize they were still beneath him. At the head of the table sat Kang Jinhyuk. Still. Unreadable. Untouchable. A senior executive once described him as a man who made decisions the way storms made landfall, without asking for permission. Another called him something else. Winter. Because nothing grew near him. Not loyalty. Not warmth. Not even ambition. Only fear. And fear was efficient. It kept the company running. It kept the numbers clean. It kept people obedient. No one questioned him. No one corrected him. No one even considered the possibility that he could be wrong. Because Kang Jinhyuk wasn't wrong. He didn't make mistakes. And if something went wrong, it meant someone else had failed. That belief had cost people their careers, their reputations. In some cases, much more than that. So when he entered a room, everything shifted. Conversations died mid-sentence. Postures straightened instantly. Even the air felt heavier, controlled, measured, waiting. And in that silence, his presence spoke louder than any command ever could. He didn't need to say, "Don't challenge me," because no one would dare. He didn't need to say, "Be perfect," because everyone already knew the cost of failure. And most importantly, he didn't need to listen. Because in his world, no one had anything worth saying. At the far end of that same table, sat someone no one was paying attention to. Amara Johnson. She wasn't supposed to be there. Not really. Interns didn't sit in high-level meetings. Interns didn't review executive reports. Interns definitely didn't get invited into rooms where million-dollar decisions were made in minutes. But someone had made a last-minute change to the attendance list. A quiet adjustment. A small oversight. Or maybe something else. Amara didn't question it. She just showed up. Because that's what she had always done. Show up. Observe. Learn. She had spent years earning her place in rooms people didn't expect her to enter. A scholarship student from Chicago. Top of her class in financial analysis. The kind of mind that saw patterns where others saw noise. But none of that mattered here. Not yet. Because in this room, she was invisible. And for the most part, she preferred it that way. While everyone else focused on Kang Jinhyuk, she focused on the numbers. Her tablet rested quietly in front of her. Her pen moved occasionally. Small notes. Quick calculations. Nothing dramatic. Nothing noticeable. She didn't stare at him like the others did. Didn't track his reactions. Didn't try to read his mood. Because she wasn't interested in him. She was interested in the data. And data didn't lie. Even when people did. Especially when people did. The presentation had started 10 minutes ago. Slides moving smoothly across the screen. Confident voice. Clean projections. It all looked perfect. Too perfect. Amara tilted her head slightly. Something felt off. Not obvious. Not loud. Just wrong. She adjusted her posture and rechecked the numbers. Once. Twice. Then again. Her brows pulled together slightly. There it was. A small inconsistency, hidden inside a larger projection. Easy to miss. Almost impossible to catch if you weren't paying attention. But she was. Because while everyone else was focused on him, she was focused on the truth. Around her, executives nodded along, agreeing, approving, accepting. Not because they fully understood every detail, but because no one wanted to be the one who slowed things down. No one wanted to be the one who questioned a report in front of Kang Jinhyuk. And definitely no one wanted to be wrong. So they stayed quiet. They always stayed quiet. Amara glanced up briefly. Her eyes scanned the room. No hesitation. No concern. Just observation. And what she saw confirmed it. No one else had caught it. Or if they had, they weren't going to say anything. Because fear was louder than logic in this room. Fear controlled the conversation. Fear controlled the outcome. Fear controlled everything. Except her. She looked back down at her notes. Recalculated. Confirmed it. Again. And again. The mistake wasn't small. It wasn't minor. It wasn't something that could be brushed aside. It was buried. But it was real. And if no one said anything, it would cost them millions. Her grip tightened slightly around her pen. Not out of fear. Out of certainty. Because now she knew. And once you knew something like that, you couldn't unsee it. The presentation continued. The director's voice steady. Confident. Unaware. Everyone else followed along. Silent. Compliant. Safe. Amara exhaled slowly. Her gaze lifted once more. This time toward the head of the table. Toward the man everyone feared. Kang Jinhyuk. He hadn't noticed it. Not yet. Or maybe he had. And simply didn't care. Either way. The room was about to move on. The decision was seconds away from being finalized. Stamped. Approved. Locked in. And no one in that room, was going to stop it. Except her. Because she saw something. Something no one else in that room dared to question. The presentation should have ended there. Clean. Efficient. Approved. That was how meetings with Kang Jinhyuk always worked. A report was delivered. A decision was made. And the room moved on. No delays. No questions. No disruptions. Especially not from someone who didn't belong in the room. The senior director clicked to the final slide. A polished summary of projections, neatly packaged into confident numbers and optimistic margins. Based on these figures, he said, voice steady despite the tension, we are projecting a net increase of approximately $10 million over the next quarter. Heads nodded. Subtle. Automatic. Agreement without resistance. Because that was the safest response. Because no one wanted to be the one who slowed things down. Because in this room, hesitation looked like weakness. And weakness didn't survive. At the head of the table, Kang Jinhyuk remained still. His fingers rested lightly against the edge of the report. His expression gave nothing away. No approval. No doubt. No reaction. Just silence. The kind of silence that ended discussions. Proceed, he said. One word. Flat. Final. And just like that, the decision was seconds away from being locked in. The director exhaled quietly, relief barely hidden behind his professional composure. The executives shifted slightly in their seats. The tension began to ease. It was over. It always was. Except, at the far end of the table, Amara Johnson didn't move. Her eyes were still on the numbers. Not the polished summary. Not the confident projection. But the floor buried beneath it. A single miscalculation. Small enough to hide. Big enough to destroy the entire outcome. She had checked it 4 times. Every angle. Every variable. There was no doubt. It was wrong. And if it went through, the company wouldn't gain 10 million. It would lose it. Silently. Slowly. But completely. Her fingers tightened slightly around her pen. Her mind moved faster now, calculating not just the numbers, but the consequences. Speaking meant risk. Staying silent meant certainty. And in a room like this, risk was dangerous. But certainty was worse. Around her, chairs shifted. Laptops began to close. People were already moving on. Because no one questioned a decision once Kang Jinhyuk had spoken. No one went back. No one corrected him. No one survived doing that. Her heartbeat rose. Not out of fear, but clarity. Because now the choice wasn't about the numbers anymore. It was about what kind of person she was willing to be. Another silent observer. Or the one who spoke when no one else would. Her gaze lifted. Slowly, directly, toward the head of the table, toward the man no one challenged, Kang Jinhyuk. He hadn't looked at her once. Not when she entered the room. Not during the meeting. Not even now. To him, she didn't exist. And maybe that was why. She spoke. That number is wrong. The words cut through the room like glass. Sharp. Clear. Unmistakable. Everything stopped. No one moved. No one breathed. The director froze mid-motion. A tablet slipped slightly in someone's hand. A chair creaked softly as someone shifted in disbelief. Because that sentence, that tone, that level of certainty, didn't belong to an intern. And definitely not in front of Kang Jinhyuk. Slowly. Very slowly. Heads turned, one by one, until every eye in the room landed on her. Amara didn't flinch. She didn't look away. She didn't even seem to realize what she had just done. Because to her, it wasn't rebellion. It was correction. Simple. Logical. Necessary. But in this room, it was something else entirely. It was defiance. And defiance had consequences. Heavy ones. The director blinked, clearly thrown off. I'm sorry. What did you just say? Amara's voice didn't change. Calm. Measured. Certain. The projection is off, she said. There's a miscalculation in the third quarter adjustment. The margin doesn't hold. Silence. Deeper this time. More dangerous. Because now it wasn't just a statement. It was a challenge. And challenges, in this room, never ended well. No one spoke. No one intervened. Because everyone already knew what came next. Punishment. Immediate. Ruthless. Unquestioned. All eyes shifted again. Not toward her this time. But toward him. Waiting. Watching. Because now, Kang Jinhyuk had heard her. For a moment, nothing happened. Kang Jinhyuk didn't move, didn't react, didn't even look up. The silence stretched. Long enough to make people uncomfortable. Long enough to make someone regret speaking. Because this was the moment where everything usually ended. A mistake. A correction. A consequence. But then, he moved. Slowly. Deliberately. He closed the report in front of him. The soft sound echoed louder than it should have. Then he stood. And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Not louder. Not chaotic. But heavier. Controlled. Focused. Dangerous. Every step he took was measured. Unrushed. Precise. And with each step, the distance between him and Amara disappeared. No one spoke. No one dared. Because everyone already knew what this looked like. An example. A lesson. A reminder of what happened when someone stepped out of line. The director lowered his gaze. Others did the same. because no one wanted to be caught watching what came next. But Amara, she didn't look away. She watched him approach. Calm, steady, unshaken, as if she didn't understand the weight of the moment. Or maybe, as if she did, and didn't care. He stopped in front of her, close enough now that the entire room could feel it. That pressure, that presence, that quiet, suffocating authority. For a second, neither of them spoke. He looked down at her. Really looked this time. Not as an intern. Not as background. But as a variable that didn't belong. Something unexpected. Something different. And then, finally, he spoke. Explain it again. The words were quiet, controlled, but they hit the room harder than any shout ever could. Because that wasn't what anyone expected. Not anger. Not dismissal. Not punishment. But attention. Real attention. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Subtle, but undeniable. Because Kang Jinhyuk didn't ask for explanations. He gave orders. He didn't invite correction. He eliminated it. And yet, here he was, standing in front of an intern, waiting. Amara didn't hesitate. She turned her tablet slightly toward him. Her voice steady, clear, professional. The error is here, she said, pointing to the projection. The third quarter adjustment assumes a stable input cost, but it doesn't account for the fluctuation in overseas supply. If you adjust for that variance, the margin collapses. He didn't interrupt, didn't question, didn't dismiss. He just listened. And as she spoke, something shifted again. Not in the room, but in him. Because this wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. This was precision, understanding, clarity, and most importantly, confidence. Not arrogance, not fear, just certainty. When she finished, the room stayed silent, waiting, because now came the real reaction. Jinhyuk's gaze remained on the screen for a moment longer, processing, calculating, verifying, and then he looked back at her. Not cold, not dismissive, but focused, sharp, interested. For the first time in years, something had broken his pattern. Something had interrupted his certainty. Something had challenged him. And survived. He straightened slightly, turned his attention back toward the table. Recalculate, he said calmly. The director froze. Yes, sir. No anger. No explosion. No punishment. Just correction. But the message was clear. She was right. And that changed everything. Because in a room where no one challenged Kang Jinhyuk, one person just had. And instead of being erased, she had been acknowledged. The shift was subtle, almost invisible. But it was there. In the way he looked at her. In the way the room reacted. In the way something unspoken began to form. Because this wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about what came after. About what it meant. About what it could become. And as Kang Jinhyuk returned to his seat, his expression unreadable once again, one truth settled quietly beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because for the first time, in a room where nothing ever surprised him, something had. And for the first time, he was interested. For a moment, nothing happened. Kang Jinhyuk didn't move, didn't react, didn't even look up. The silence stretched, long enough to make people uncomfortable, long enough to make someone regret speaking. Because this was the moment where everything usually ended. A mistake, a correction, a consequence. But then, he moved. Slowly, deliberately. He closed the report in front of him. The soft sound echoed louder than it should have. Then he stood. And just like that, the tension in the room shifted. Not louder. Not chaotic. But heavier. Controlled. Focused. Dangerous. Every step he took was measured. Unrushed. Precise. And with each step, the distance between him and Amara disappeared. No one spoke. No one dared. Because everyone already knew what this looked like. An example. A lesson. A reminder of what happened when someone stepped out of line. The director lowered his gaze. Others did the same. Because no one wanted to be caught watching what came next. But Amara. She didn't look away. She watched him approach. Calm. Steady. Unshaken. As if she didn't understand the weight of the moment. Or maybe, as if she did. And didn't care. He stopped in front of her. Close enough now that the entire room could feel it. That pressure. That presence. That quiet, suffocating authority. For a second, neither of them spoke. He looked down at her. Really looked this time. Not as an intern. Not as background. But as a variable that didn't belong. Something unexpected. Something different. And then, finally, he spoke. Explain it again. The words were quiet. Controlled. But they hit the room harder than any shout ever could. Because that wasn't what anyone expected. Not anger. Not dismissal. Not punishment. But attention. Real attention. A ripple of shock moved through the room. Subtle. But undeniable. Because Kang Jinhyuk didn't ask for explanations. He gave orders. He didn't invite correction. He eliminated it. And yet, here he was. Standing in front of an intern. Waiting. Amara didn't hesitate. She turned her tablet slightly toward him. Her voice steady. Clear. Professional. The error is here, she said, pointing to the projection. The third quarter adjustment assumes a stable input cost, but it doesn't account for the fluctuation in overseas supply. If you adjust for that variance, the margin collapses. He didn't interrupt. Didn't question. Didn't dismiss. He just listened. And as she spoke, something shifted again. Not in the room, but in him. Because this wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. This was precision. Understanding. Clarity. And most importantly, confidence. Not arrogance. Not fear. Just certainty. When she finished, the room stayed silent. Waiting. Because now came the real reaction. Jinhyuk's gaze remained on the screen for a moment longer. Processing. Calculating. Verifying. And then, he looked back at her. Not cold. Not dismissive. But focused. Sharp. Interested. For the first time in years. Something had broken his pattern. Something had interrupted his certainty. Something had challenged him. And survived. He straightened slightly. Turned his attention back toward the table. Recalculate, he said calmly. The director froze. Yes, sir. No anger. No explosion. No punishment. Just correction. But the message was clear. She was right. And that changed everything. Because in a room where no one challenged Kang Jinhyuk, one person just had. And instead of being erased, she had been acknowledged. The shift was subtle. Almost invisible. But it was there. In the way he looked at her. In the way the room reacted. In the way something unspoken began to form. Because this wasn't just about a mistake anymore. It was about what came after. About what it meant. About what it could become. And as Kang Jinhyuk returned to his seat, his expression unreadable once again, one truth settled quietly beneath the surface. This wasn't over. Not even close. Because for the first time, in a room where nothing ever surprised him, something had. And for the first time, he was interested. The meeting ended the way all meetings with Kang Jinhyuk did. Efficient. Controlled. Final. But something about this one lingered. Not in the room. Not in the reports. In him. He didn't show it. Didn't acknowledge it. Didn't speak of it. But long after the executives filed out, after the chairs were pushed back into place, after the city lights began to replace the fading daylight outside the glass walls, his attention hadn't moved on. It stayed where it wasn't supposed to. On her. Amara Johnson. An intern. A variable that didn't fit. That should have been the end of it. A correction. A recalculation. A closed loop. But it wasn't. Because something about the way she spoke. The way she didn't hesitate. The way she didn't fear him. Didn't align with anything he understood. And Kang Jinhyuk didn't ignore things he didn't understand. He studied them. That night, long after most of the building had emptied, a file appeared on his desk. Thin. Precise. Complete. Her file. He didn't ask for it. He didn't need to. Information had a way of finding him. He opened it. Slowly. Methodically. Line by line. Amara Johnson. Age. 24. Origin. Chicago. Academic records. Exceptional. Top percentile. Advanced certifications. Awards. Too many for someone sitting at the far end of a boardroom as an intern. His gaze narrowed slightly. This wasn't oversight. This was misplacement. He continued reading. Internship placement. Recent. Recommendation letters. Strong. But buried beneath all of it. A pattern. She didn't stay where she was expected. Didn't follow predictable paths. Didn't rely on connections. Everything she had. She earned. And yet, she had accepted a position far beneath her capability. Why? The question stayed. Unanswered. Unresolved. Interesting. He closed the file. But the thought didn't leave. The next morning, he noticed something else. She didn't seek attention. Didn't linger where she wasn't needed. Didn't try to capitalize on what had happened. No subtle attempts to stand out. No conversations in the hallway. No whispers of ambition. It was as if the moment in the boardroom never happened. She went back to work. Quiet. Focused. Invisible again. But now, he noticed her. And once Kang Jinhyuk noticed something, it didn't disappear. From his office, he began to observe. Not openly. Not directly. But consistently. She worked differently. While others rushed through tasks to meet expectations, she slowed down. Analyzed. Verified. While others checked boxes, she questioned them. Not out loud. Never out loud. But in the way she moved. The way she paused. The way she thought. She didn't perform. She understood. And that was rare. Days passed. Then a week. And still, she didn't change. Didn't approach him. Didn't acknowledge the shift. Didn't try to use the moment. If anything, she seemed unaware of it. Or uninterested. And that was the problem. Because everyone else wanted something from him. Recognition. Approval. Power. She didn't. And that made her dangerous. Not to him. But to the order of things. Because people who didn't want anything were harder to control. Harder to predict. Harder to ignore. He found himself watching her more often. Not intentionally. At first. But gradually. More deliberately. Noticing patterns. Noticing details. Noticing her. And with every observation, one thing became clearer. She wasn't supposed to be an intern. She was supposed to be something else. Something more. And the more he understood that, the less he could ignore her. Because this wasn't just curiosity anymore. It was something deeper. Something quieter. Something unfamiliar. And Kang Jinhyuk didn't like unfamiliar things. But he also didn't walk away from them. He leaned in. Closer. Until he understood them completely. What he didn't realize was that in trying to understand her, he had already crossed a line. A line no one else had ever made him cross before. And once that line was crossed, there was no going back. The first time he called her into his office, it wasn't announced. No assistant. No formal request. No warning. Just a message. Short. Direct. Come to my office. That was it. No explanation. No context. Just an order. The kind that made people nervous. The kind that made people overthink. The kind that made people afraid. But when Amara read it, she didn't hesitate. Didn't overanalyze. Didn't panic. She simply stood up. And went. The walk to his office was quiet. Long. Every step echoing against polished floors. People noticed. Of course they did. They always noticed when someone was called to him. But this time, there was something different in the air. Curiosity. Whispers. Because everyone remembered the meeting. Everyone remembered what she had done. And now, they were waiting to see what it would cost her. She reached the door. Paused for a moment. Then knocked. Come in. His voice was calm. Controlled. Unreadable. She stepped inside. The office was exactly what she expected. Minimal. Expensive. Precise. Everything in its place. Everything intentional. Including him. He stood near the window, overlooking the city. Back turned. Silent. For a moment. Neither of them spoke. Then. He turned. Slowly. His gaze locked onto hers. Not cold. Not distant. Focused. Evaluating. You corrected a senior director in front of the entire board, he said. Not a question. A statement. Amara didn't look away. Yes. No apology. No explanation. Just truth. A pause. Subtle. Measured. Why? He asked. Simple. Direct. But layered. Amara considered the question. Not because she didn't know the answer, but because she wanted to say it right. Because the numbers were wrong, she said. Calm. Clear. Certain. He studied her. Waiting for more. There wasn't any. No justification. No attempt to soften it. Just the answer. And something about that. Something about how simple it was. Shifted the room again. Most people would have said something different. Something safer. Something strategic. Not her. She didn't play the game. She didn't even acknowledge that there was one. You weren't concerned about the consequences, he asked. Another pause. Another chance to retreat. She didn't take it. If the numbers were approved, she said, the consequences would have been worse. Silence. Not tense. Not heavy. Just still. Because she wasn't wrong. And more importantly, she wasn't afraid to be right. Jinhyuk took a step closer. Not aggressive. Not threatening. But intentional. Closing the distance. You're not afraid of me, he said. Again. Not a question. Amara held his gaze. I don't know you, she replied. Honest. Unfiltered. And somehow, more powerful than anything else she could have said. Because fear usually came from reputation. From stories. From what people believed. She didn't operate on belief. She operated on fact. And right now, he was just a man asking questions. That realization settled between them. Quiet. Unspoken. But undeniable. For the first time in a long time, Kang Jinhyuk wasn't being treated like a force. Or a threat. or a myth. He was being treated like a variable, something to understand, not something to fear. And that changed everything. He exhaled slowly. Not frustration, not tension, just thought. "You're overqualified for your position," he said. She didn't react, didn't deny it, didn't confirm it, just listened. "Why are you here?" he asked. Another question. Another layer. Amara's answer came just as calmly. "Because I wanted to be." No elaboration. No story. Just choice. And that answer, more than anything else, stayed with him. Because it meant one thing. She wasn't there by accident. She wasn't there out of necessity. She was there because she chose to be. And people who chose their position could choose to leave it just as easily. He watched her for a moment longer, then nodded once. Subtle. Almost imperceptible. "You can go." Dismissed. But not rejected. Not erased. Not forgotten. Amara turned. Walked toward the door. Same steady pace. Same quiet presence. But something had shifted. Not just for him. For her too. Because now, she knew he was watching. And he knew she wasn't afraid. And in a world built on power and control, that combination was dangerous. For both of them. The door closed behind her. Soft. Final. But the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was charged. Because this wasn't just a conversation. It was the beginning of something neither of them had planned. Something neither of them fully understood. And something that, if it continued, would not stay hidden for long. Because noticing her was never the problem. Keeping her unnoticed, that was. And what Kang Jinhyuk didn't realize yet was that in a world like his, attention was never neutral. It was exposure. It was risk. It was a signal. And someone else had already started watching. Because noticing her made her visible to the wrong people. Han Soo-jin didn't believe in coincidence. Not in business. Not in power. And definitely not when it came to Kang Jinhyuk. Men like him didn't change. They didn't hesitate. They didn't shift their focus. They didn't start noticing people they had ignored for years. And yet, something had changed. She saw it before anyone else did. Because unlike the others who feared him, she studied him. Carefully. Patiently. The way predators studied other predators. From the outside, Han Soo-jin was everything society admired. Elegant. Refined. Untouchably composed. The only daughter of a legacy crime family that had survived decades of silent wars and shifting alliances. Where others inherited wealth, she inherited control. And she made it stronger. Smarter. Deadlier. Her family didn't operate loudly. They didn't need to. Influence moved through quiet channels. Through carefully placed people. Through decisions that looked harmless. Until they weren't. And Soo-jin. She was the one who made those decisions now. At 28, she had already done what many couldn't. She stabilized power. Expanded territory. Eliminated weaknesses. Without chaos. Without noise. Without mistakes. That was what made her dangerous. Not emotion. Not anger. Precision. And for a long time, Kang Jinhyuk had been the only man she considered an equal. Not a rival. Not an enemy. But something else. A potential alignment. A strategic alliance that could merge two empires into something no one could challenge. It made sense. On paper. In power. In legacy. There was only one problem. Kang Jinhyuk had never shown interest. Not in alliances. Not in relationships. Not in anything that involved compromise. He didn't share power. He absorbed it. And for years, Sujin had respected that, even admired it. But now, something didn't add up. It started small. A shift in meeting schedules. Unusual attention to lower-level reports. A name that appeared more than once in internal systems. At first, it meant nothing. Then it became a pattern. And Hon Sujin didn't ignore patterns. So she followed it. Quietly. Systematically. Until it led her somewhere unexpected. Amara Johnson. An intern. Sujin stared at the file longer than necessary. Not because she didn't understand it, but because she did. Too well. Brilliant. Overqualified. Unremarkable position. And suddenly, visible. Her fingers tapped lightly against the table. Slow. Deliberate. Because now the question wasn't who Amara was. It was why Kang Jinhyuk was paying attention to her. Men like him didn't waste time. They didn't entertain distractions. They didn't deviate from control. So if he was watching her, if he had called her into his office, if her name was appearing in places it shouldn't, then she wasn't a coincidence. She was a variable. And variables had to be managed or removed. Sujin leaned back slightly, eyes narrowing, calculating. Because this wasn't jealousy. It wasn't emotion. It was strategy. And strategy demanded clarity. If Amara Johnson was a weakness, she would be eliminated. If she was an asset, she would be controlled. But either way, she would not be ignored. Because in a world where power was everything, anything that shifted power became a threat. And Hon Sujin didn't tolerate threats. Not even small ones. Especially not the ones that looked harmless. Amara noticed the shift before she understood it. It wasn't obvious. Not loud. Not direct. Just different. People looked at her longer than they used to. Conversations quieted when she walked past. Even the air in certain spaces felt heavier. Like something unseen had settled in. Watching. Waiting. At first, she dismissed it. Office dynamics changed all the time. Especially after moments like the one in the boardroom. Attention came. Attention faded. That was normal. But this didn't feel normal. It felt intentional. Controlled. Like a slow adjustment happening around her. And then, she saw her. Hon Sujin. The first time was in the lobby. Amara didn't know who she was. Not yet. She only noticed her because everyone else did. The shift was immediate. Subtle. But unmistakable. Security straightened. Executives lowered their voices. Staff moved with sharper precision. Not fear. Not exactly. But respect edged with caution. Sujin walked through the space like she owned it. Not in a loud way. Not in a performative way. But in the way someone does when they know no one will stop them. Her presence was controlled. Measured. Quietly dominant. And when her gaze passed over Amara, it didn't linger. It didn't react. It didn't acknowledge. But something in that moment registered. Amara felt it. A flicker. A recognition without interaction. And then it was gone. As if it never happened. But it had. Because later that day, everything changed. The message came without a name. No sender. No context. Just a time. And a location. Rooftop. 7:30. Amara stared at it for a moment. Confused. Cautious. But not afraid. She didn't overthink it. Didn't ask around. Didn't try to trace it. Something told her. She was meant to go. So she did. The rooftop was quiet. Empty. The city stretched endlessly beneath the fading light. Wind moved softly through the space. Carrying that same feeling. That same subtle tension. And then, she heard it. Footsteps. Measured. Unhurried. Amara turned. And there she was. Hon Soo-jin. Up close. She was even more controlled than she appeared from a distance. Every movement precise. Every expression intentional. She didn't rush. Didn't speak immediately. She simply walked forward. And stopped a few feet away. Silence settled between them. Not awkward. Not uncertain. Just deliberate. "You're new," Soo-jin said finally. Her voice was calm. Soft. But it carried weight. Amara nodded slightly. Yes. A pause. Soo-jin studied her. Not casually. Not politely. But thoroughly. As if measuring something invisible. "You speak when others don't," she continued. Not a question. An observation. Amara didn't respond immediately. She didn't need to. Because this wasn't a conversation. It was an assessment. "You corrected a mistake," Soo-jin said. "Most people wouldn't." Amara met her gaze. "They should have." Another pause. Longer this time. Because that answer wasn't defensive. It wasn't submissive. It was honest. And honesty, in a place like this, was dangerous. Soo-jin stepped slightly closer. Not threatening. Not aggressive. But enough to shift the space between them. "You're intelligent," she said quietly. "And that's valuable. A compliment. On the surface. But something underneath it. Didn't feel like one. It also makes you visible." Amara didn't move. Didn't step back. Didn't react. But inside, something tightened. Because now, this wasn't observation anymore. It was direction. Subtle. Controlled. But clear. Soo-jin's gaze sharpened slightly. "There are rooms where visibility is an advantage," she said. "And there are rooms where it's a liability." The wind shifted again. Cooler now. Sharper. "You're in the second kind." Silence. Heavy. Intentional. And then, the final step. The final layer. Soo-jin's voice softened slightly. Almost gentle. "If I were you," she said, "I would be careful where I stand. Not a threat. Not directly. But something worse. A warning. Wrapped in calm. Delivered without emotion. Because real danger didn't need to be loud. It didn't need to be obvious. It only needed to be understood." Soo-jin turned. No hesitation. No lingering. And just like that, she walked away. Leaving nothing behind. Except the weight of what she had said. And the realization of what it meant. Amara stood there for a moment longer. Still. Silent. Processing. Because now, something had shifted. Something real. Something irreversible. Because this wasn't about a meeting anymore. Or a mistake. Or a correction. This was something else. Something bigger. Something far more dangerous. And what Amara didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. Because in a world ruled by power and control, being noticed wasn't an opportunity. It was exposure. And exposure came with consequences. Consequences she hadn't even begun to understand. Because Amara had no idea. She had just stepped into a war. The warning didn't come again. It didn't need to. Because after that night on the rooftop, things didn't escalate loudly. They tightened. Subtly. Systematically. And Amara felt it. At first, it was small. A report she submitted went missing. An access request was suddenly denied. Emails she had sent never reached their recipients. Mistakes began to appear under her name. Errors she knew she hadn't made. Tiny at first. Then bigger. More visible. More damaging. At the same time, whispers began. Quiet. Controlled. Strategic. She's overstepping. She's trying to stand out. She's not as careful as she seems. Nothing direct. Nothing traceable. But enough to shift perception. Enough to isolate her. And in a place like Kong Global, perception was everything. Amara noticed. Of course she did. She retraced her steps. Double-checked her work. Verified everything. But no matter how precise she was, the inconsistencies continued. Because this wasn't error. It was design. And then, it escalated. The audit notice came late in the afternoon. Unexpected. Immediate. A financial discrepancy tied to her credentials. Significant enough to trigger internal review. Serious enough to involve upper management. Amara stared at the screen. Calm on the outside. But her mind moved fast. Too fast. Because now, this wasn't subtle anymore. This was direct. Someone wasn't just watching her. They were building a case. And in this world, a case like that didn't end with questions. It ended with removal. Permanent. Still. She didn't panic. Didn't run. Didn't react. Because fear wouldn't fix it. Only clarity would. So she did what she always did. She followed the numbers. Traced the entries. Tracked the timestamps. And slowly, the truth began to surface. The transactions weren't random. They were planted. Carefully. Deliberately. And whoever did it knew exactly how to hide it. Which meant one thing. This wasn't personal. Not entirely. It was strategic. And that made it dangerous. Because strategy didn't stop halfway. It finished what it started. That night, the building was quieter than usual. Most apartments had cleared out. Lights dimmed. Hallways empty. Amara stayed. She needed answers. Needed proof. Needed something she could hold on to before things spiraled further. Her footsteps echoed softly as she moved through the corridor. Focused. Unaware of how isolated she had become. Until the elevator doors opened behind her. She didn't turn at first. Didn't think much of it. Until she heard it. More than one set of footsteps. Measured. Coordinated. Too deliberate to be coincidence. She slowed slightly. Listened. The sound didn't fade. It followed. Closer now. Something shifted. Not panic. Not yet. But awareness. She turned. Two men. Suits. Clean. Professional. But wrong. Not employees. Not security. Their expressions were blank. Controlled. And the moment their eyes locked onto hers, she understood. This wasn't about the audit. This was something else. Something final. Miss Johnson, one of them said calmly. Come with us. Not a request. A directive. Amara didn't move. Didn't step back. Didn't speak. But her mind was already calculating. Distance. Exits. Time. You're being asked politely, the second man added. Still calm. Still controlled. Which made it worse. Because politeness, in moments like this, was a mask. The hallway felt smaller. Tighter. Like the space itself was closing in. Amara's pulse quickened. Not fear. Instinct. Because now, there was no more pretending. No more subtlety. No more warnings. This was the move. The one that ended everything. And then, everything changed. The sound came first. Sharp. Precise. Unmistakable. Footsteps. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Controlled. Commanding. The two men paused. Just slightly. Just enough. And in that small hesitation, the entire situation shifted. Because they recognized it. Before they even saw him. Kang Jinhyuk didn't run. He didn't need to. He walked. straight down the corridor, toward them, toward her. And with every step, the air changed. He didn't raise his voice, didn't shout, didn't demand, but his presence alone was enough. The men straightened, their posture adjusting instinctively, because they knew who he was. Everyone did. And in this world, there were rules, unspoken, but absolute. You didn't act without permission. You didn't move without clearance. And you definitely didn't touch what belonged to Kang Jinhyuk. His gaze moved from them to her. Quick, sharp, assessing. One look. That was all it took. He understood everything. Not the details. Not yet. But enough. Enough to know this wasn't coincidence. Enough to know this wasn't internal. Enough to know someone had crossed a line. And then he spoke. You're in the wrong place. Calm. Flat. Final. The first man tried to recover. This doesn't concern you. He didn't finish. Because Jinhyuk stepped closer. And that was enough. Enough to silence him. Enough to remind him. Enough to shift the balance completely. You were sent, Jinhyuk said. Not a question. A statement. The men didn't answer. Didn't need to. Because now, the situation wasn't theirs anymore. It was his. And when something became his, it ended one way. Completely. His gaze hardened. Not visibly. Not dramatically. But something beneath the surface shifted. Cold. Decisive. Unforgiving. You don't touch what's mine. The words were quiet. But they landed like a verdict. Final. Irreversible. The men stepped back. Slowly. Carefully. Because now, they understood. This wasn't just interference. This was protection. Direct. Personal. And in a world like this, that changed everything. Without another word, they left. No resistance. No argument. Because they knew. This wasn't over. Not even close. The corridor fell silent again. But this silence was different. Heavier. Charged. Because now, there was no ambiguity left. No subtlety. No distance. Kang Jinhyuk turned toward Amara. Fully this time. No barriers. No distractions. Just him. And her. You shouldn't be here alone, he said. Not anger. Not blame. Just fact. Amara held his gaze. Still steady. Still grounded. I didn't know they were coming, she replied. Honest. Simple. And somehow, that made it worse. Because she wasn't careless. She wasn't reckless. She was targeted. And that was something he didn't tolerate. Not in his world. Not under his control. His jaw tightened slightly. The smallest shift. But enough to reveal something deeper. Something rare. Something dangerous. Because this wasn't about business anymore. It wasn't about power. It wasn't even about control. It was personal. And personal was unpredictable. I told you to be careful, he said quietly. A reminder. A warning. A truth. Amara didn't look away. And I was, she replied. A pause. Because both of them knew. Careful wasn't enough anymore. Not here. Not now. Not when someone had already made their move. The distance between them felt smaller now. Different. Because something had changed. Irreversibly. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then made a decision. Not calculated. Not strategic. Instinct. And that was new. You're coming with me, he said. No hesitation. No room for argument. Because this wasn't a suggestion. It was a choice. His choice. And that That was the moment everything shifted. Because in choosing to step in choosing to protect her, in choosing to make this personal, Kang Jinhyuk had just crossed a line. One that couldn't be undone. One that would trigger consequences far beyond this hallway. Far beyond this moment. Far beyond control. Because protection, in a world like his, was never quiet. It was visible. It was deliberate. It was a declaration. And declarations didn't stay hidden. Not for long. Because what came next wouldn't happen in silence. It wouldn't happen in shadows. It wouldn't happen behind closed doors. No. What came next would be seen by everyone. Because that was the only way to make it clear. The only way to send the message. The only way to end it. And that was when he made his choice. In front of everyone. The next morning, the building felt different. Not subtly. Not quietly. But noticeably. Because word had spread. Not details. Not facts. But something close enough to truth to make people uneasy. Something had happened. And Kang Jinhyuk was involved. That alone was enough to shift everything. By the time the executive meeting was called, everyone was already on edge. The boardroom on the 48th floor filled faster than usual. Seats taken early. Voices lower than normal. No one wanted to miss what was coming. Because when Kang Jinhyuk called an unscheduled meeting, it meant one thing. Something was about to change. He entered last. As always. Calm. Controlled. Unreadable. But today, there was something else. Something sharper beneath the surface. He didn't sit immediately. Didn't speak right away. He simply stood at the head of the table and let the silence settle. Heavy. Intentional. Unavoidable. Every eye was on him. Waiting. Watching. And then, the door opened again. Heads turned. And the room froze. Amara Johnson walked in. Not rushed. Not hesitant. But composed. Steady. Present. And for the first time, not invisible. Whispers didn't start. They couldn't. Because no one understood what they were seeing. An intern. Walking into an executive meeting. At his side. Jinhyuk didn't look at them. Didn't acknowledge the reaction. He simply gestured once. A seat. Not at the end of the table. Not hidden. But near him. Deliberate. Visible. Unmistakable. Amara paused for half a second. Then took the seat. And in that moment, everything shifted. Because this wasn't quiet recognition. This wasn't subtle approval. This was a statement. A message. A line being drawn. Jinhyuk finally spoke. Effective immediately, he said calmly. Amara Johnson will be reassigned. A pause. Not for effect. But for impact. She will report directly to me. Silence. Absolute. Because that didn't happen. Not here. Not ever. Executives exchanged brief glances. Controlled. Careful. But stunned. Because reporting directly to Kang Jinhyuk wasn't a promotion. It was power. And power was never given lightly. He continued. Any matters concerning her work, come through me. No elaboration. No explanation. Just authority. Final. Unquestionable. And just like that, the hierarchy changed. In a single sentence. Because now, she wasn't just protected. She was positioned. Elevated. Untouchable. And everyone in that room understood exactly what that meant. This wasn't business. This wasn't strategy. This was personal. And personal was dangerous. Jinhyuk sat down. The meeting continued. As if nothing had happened. But everything had. Because from that moment on, Amara Johnson was no longer invisible. She was seen by everyone. The meeting ended. Slowly. Carefully. No one rushed out. No one spoke too loudly. Because the shift still lingered. Heavy. Unsettled. And when the room finally cleared, only two people remained. Amara stood near the window. The city stretched endlessly below. Alive. Unpredictable. Just like everything around her now. She didn't speak. Didn't turn. Because she knew he was still there. Behind her. Watching. Thinking. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It wasn't uncertain. It was different. Quieter than before. Less guarded. Jinhyuk stepped closer. Not too close. Just enough. You understand what this means, he said. Not a question. Amara nodded slightly. Yes. Her voice was calm. But there was something beneath it now. Awareness. Because she did understand. This wasn't just protection. It was exposure. Amplified. Permanent. You could have stayed out of it, she said after a moment. Not accusing. Not questioning. Just stating the truth. He didn't answer immediately. Because she was right. He could have. He should have. That would have been the smarter move. The safer move. The predictable move. But he didn't. And that was the part he couldn't ignore. I don't do things halfway, he said finally. Simple. Direct. But not complete. Amara turned slightly. Just enough to look at him. And for the first time, there was no distance in her gaze. No barrier. No separation between power and person. Just understanding. You made it personal, she said. A quiet observation. But it landed deeper than anything else. Because it was true. And he knew it. For a moment. Kang Jinhyuk said nothing. Because this wasn't a boardroom. This wasn't strategy. This wasn't control. This was something else. Something unfamiliar. Something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. If ever. He stepped closer. Closing the distance completely now. Not as a CEO. Not as a man in control. But as someone standing at the edge of something he didn't fully understand. You changed something, he said. His voice lower now. Less guarded. More real. Something rare. Something honest. I thought was beyond repair. The words settled between them. Quiet. Unshaken. And for a moment, everything else faded. The power. The danger. The world they were in. All of it. Because this was the truth beneath everything. But truths like that didn't stay simple. Not in a world like theirs. Not when lines had already been crossed. Not when enemies were already moving. Because outside that room, things were already shifting. Already reacting. Already escalating. And what felt like a resolution was only the beginning of something far more dangerous. Because power didn't like disruption. And it didn't stay silent when challenged. And what neither of them realized yet was that this moment, this choice, this connection, had already triggered something much bigger. Something they couldn't see. Something they couldn't stop. Not yet. Because this story was far from over. The night should have ended quietly. It didn't. Long after the building emptied, after the lights dimmed, after even the city outside began to slow, something moved. Not loudly, not visibly, but deliberately. Inside Kang Jinhyuk's private office, a file appeared. No notification, no alert. Just a single encrypted document sitting on his secured system. Untouched, untraceable, waiting. Jinhyuk noticed it immediately. Of course he did. Nothing entered his system without reason. Nothing appeared without intent. He didn't open it right away. He studied it first. Metadata. Clean. Origin. Masked. Security layers. Bypassed in a way that shouldn't have been possible. Which meant one thing. This wasn't random. This wasn't amateur. This was someone who knew exactly what they were doing. And more importantly, someone who knew how to reach him. He opened the file. Slowly. Carefully. Inside. Numbers. Familiar ones. The same financial report from the boardroom. The same $10 million projection. But this time, it was different. Highlighted sections. Hidden adjustments. A deeper layer beneath the surface calculation. Jinhyuk's gaze sharpened. Because now, he saw it. Not just the mistake, but the design behind it. The miscalculation wasn't accidental. It wasn't oversight. It was planted. Engineered. Precise enough to pass unnoticed. Unless someone looked closely. Very closely. Unless someone like Amara. The realization settled slowly. Heavy. Unavoidable. Because this changed everything. The mistake wasn't just a mistake. It was bait. And she had taken it. Exactly as intended. Jinhyuk leaned back slightly. Eyes still locked on the screen. Because now, the question wasn't what happened. It was why. Why create an error that subtle? Why risk exposure? Why design something that required someone like her to find it? Unless. That was the point. Unless. She wasn't just the one who noticed it. Unless. She was meant to. The next file opened automatically. As if whoever sent it knew he would keep going. This one wasn't numbers. It was structure. Connections. A map. Names. Departments. Timelines. And at the center of it, one pattern. Everything traced back to a single moment. The boardroom. The correction. Amara speaking. Jinhyuk's attention shifting. And from there, everything else followed. The audit. The whispers. The attack. His intervention. Her elevation. Every move. Connected. Not random. Not reactive. Planned. Step by step. Like pieces placed on a board long before the game began. Jinhyuk's expression didn't change. But something behind it did. Because now, he understood. This wasn't about power. Not entirely. This wasn't about removing her. Or testing him. This was something else. Something deeper. Someone had created a situation where only one outcome was possible. She speaks. He notices. He protects. He chooses. Every step. Predicted. Controlled. Inevitable. Which meant he hadn't made a decision. He had followed a path. A path someone else had designed. His jaw tightened slightly. Because that was something he didn't allow. Control. Taken from him. Silently. Perfectly. And the most dangerous part was that it worked. His gaze returned to the screen. To the final line in the file. No name. No signature. Just a message. Simple. Cold. Certain. She was never just an intern. She was part of the plan. Silence filled the room. Heavy. Unforgiving. Because now, everything he thought he understood was incomplete. Every move he made had been seen, anticipated, used. And the one question that remained was the only one that mattered. Who? Who could orchestrate something like this? Who could get that close without being seen? Who could move inside his world without triggering alarms? Jinhyuk's eyes darkened slightly because there was only one answer. Someone close. Someone trusted. Someone already inside. And as the screen dimmed slightly, One final realization settled in. Slow. Dangerous. Certain. The game hadn't started in the boardroom. It had started long before that. And he had been playing it. Without even knowing. Because the person behind it wasn't watching from the outside. They were already inside his world. Already within reach. Already too close. And the most dangerous part of all was that he might have already seen them, spoken to them, trusted them, and still didn't know, because the person behind it was closer than he ever imagined.